Hey everyone, Tim Higgins here with A&I Solutions. So we're going to talk about, I'm going to do some videos on dev test, but I'm going to focus on, I think it's called application test now. But in application test, you have three products into one. Dev test is one of them. And then the other one is service virtualization. And I'm going to really focus on that one. So I'm going to do a set of videos on service virtualization. Now, if anybody's seen any of my other videos, you know I hate I hate slide decks, right? I hate PowerPoint, just mainly because it's just a way to put words out there. It's really all it is with some images. But unfortunately, there are some techie terms for service virtualization that you need to know. Now, I'm going to focus this as more of a 101 type thing. It's not really made for training. It's more of an introduction and not really a POC or a full-blown demo. I just want to show you how some things work, right? So we can go through each of those. Now, with saying that, service virtualization is probably one of the most, it's a really complicated application to understand if you're not explained to it correctly, but it's really easy to understand if you just think of the basic layman terms. And that's why I wanted to start with this. So what we're going to do is go to the next slide. So first thing you have is transactions. What is a transaction? Well, the transaction is the heart of your recording. Now we're going to use terms loosely like recording, virtual services. Now it's not virtual servers, that's hardware based. This is virtual services. This is based on services. Well, what makes up a service is a transaction, right? And in this case, if you're looking at the screen, the transaction in basic layman's terms, and I'm not going to read the slide deck, I'm just going to kind of talk through it. So it's basically, it's common sense. It's when a client and a server are communicating, right? It's that transaction in between that makes up the transaction. And this is the piece that we're going to focus on virtualizing. Now, I didn't explain why we would do that, and hopefully if you're watching this video, you already have that mindset. But the concept is we can replace this backend or any of these pieces. You're going to see that in many other images, and especially when we do it. So if you think about a manager, and I'm managing a team of developers, right? And we're working on a front end. I'm just going to use this two-tier here. I'm working on a front end, but I can't touch the back end because it's a third party, or maybe they're upgrading WebSphere or something for that matter. Well, I can virtualize this piece and get these responses back as if they're realistic and not have to worry about or be dependent on this backend. Okay. So anyway, so the concept, sorry, I got off tangent here. I digress, but the concept is you have a client and a server transaction, and that's really the heart of, let's say, transactions are the foundation of virtual service. Okay, so it makes sense. Now, whenever you look at creating a virtual service, there's two main ways, right? Technically, there's more, but we'll focus on the two. There's two main ways that you want to think about that virtual service can assist you in creating these virtual endpoints. I like to call them virtual endpoints because it's really what they are in a way. And again, that's loosely because you'll see in a few minutes in a slide deck that there's more than just web services that you can do. But in this case, we're going to do some live recordings, which is pretty cool. Yep, sorry about that. And then we're going to be able to do some request response. And request response is really what it is, right? So I request, usually it's a GET these days if you're using REST, and then my response is whatever JSON payload is that comes back, okay? Now, there's this concept of stateless and conversation. Now, the really cool thing that dev test does is it takes your data and it tries to normalize it into something that makes sense. Now, this page, when I first saw this, didn't make sense to me when I went through training about 10 or 20 years ago, whenever it first came out. The concept is you have a stateless, well, I'm sorry, but now it makes lots of sense. So I'll explain to you in layman's terms, which will make sense. A stateless means a transaction does not depend on the next transaction, okay? I clicked a button, I sent an email. Okay, that has nothing to do with anything else. A conversational means that one transaction is dependent on another transaction. And you're going to see another image in a few seconds. It makes sense. But their example here is an ATM. I enter in a PIN. I select an account. I view the balance. Okay, all three of those have to work together. Okay, so that's a conversation. And I put this image on there because to me this makes sense. And here, here's your raw transactions. Here's your logical, which would be stateless, right? Because if I clicked a button, it did its job. Now, here's one that says, hey, do something. Oh, wait, do something else. Oh, do something else. Okay, I got you. So that's really the biggest difference between those two. Now, the good news is dev test tries to figure this out for you. You can also tell it, and you'll see that when we do. I'm trying to be careful what I tell you because you can see a lot of this when you see it in action. Okay. Now, dev test, I call it dev test service virtualization, the same thing. Okay. Dev test is the overall parent application. Service virtualization is an app within it. Okay, and that service virtualization is what we're focused on. But when you think about service virtualization, you have to think about your transport protocol. And again, this is something that was kind of confusing. If you read the docs, it doesn't make sense. It gets really tied down to what the information is. What it really means is, what are you using for your protocol? Okay, HTTP, HTTPS, TCP, and you'll see a list of them in a few minutes. That's why I did that. Put that list on there. It pretty makes sense. And then the others say, okay, the data protocol. To me, when I think of data, I think of like a database, right? What is the physical data, like my payload? Okay, well, same thing. Think of it here. But not the database. Think of it as your payload, right? So what is my data that's coming through? So service virtualization can know how to read it. Well, in this case, SOAP and REST are the most common. Okay. And again, I put this on here just because maybe it helps give you a better view. For an example, as of right now, and this list has probably changed, all these slide decks or all these images came from Broadcom or CA. So this may not be the latest version. I was just trying to look at it, see if anything in my mind changed. But if you think about, if I'm doing a live recording, here's the protocols. Remember I said HTTP, HTTPS. Let's go back one. And I'm trying to speed this up because I'm going to get to the demos. But you got your protocols, and then you got your transport. I would get rid of the word protocols because that's what makes it kind of confusing. But your transport and your data, okay? And that kind of makes sense. So here, my transport can be any of these in my live recording. Again, 99% of the time, you're probably focused on HTTP and HTTPS. I've done a lot of WebSphere. I've done some JMS and Java. So those are probably the most common ones. I don't really know why I would ever use TCP. I guess if I'm virtualizing the fact that I'm uploading to a TCP server, but it's just one of the options, right? So, and then when you think of the other side of the world, you also have the WSDL, you have a Swagger, can support that. You can support Broadcom Layer 7. And most importantly, I've done a lot, is that you can do a lot from scratch, okay? Now, this continuous application insight, it's called CAI. We're not going to talk about it, but when I said there's 3 products built into application test, and that's probably why they changed the name. There's dev test, there's service virtualization, and then there's continuous application insight. And that's more of an agent that kind of learns what's on the system. I'm probably not going to do any videos on it in this suite because I want to focus on service virtualization. Now, the other thing service virtualization does that's very important is called matching. Now, matching is, what does it do if and you'll see this, and that's the reason we're doing these terms. And I'm going to say them again. So you don't need a pencil, you don't need a piece of paper, you don't even need to be thinking right now. You should just be drinking a cup of coffee and say, okay, Tim, hurry up and get through this so we can get to the demos. But if you think about it, whenever I do a recording, I'm going to say, okay, match on www.timhiggins.com/get users. Okay, well, what happens if that would be my match? So then my match should say, okay, we found that. We found where you made that recording. We found where you have this mock data. So we're going to return that for you. Okay, and that's all that's saying. If it doesn't match, you can create a default, which is pretty cool. And we're going to show that as well. Okay. And that's really probably the most important thing here, just to get you started, right? Magic strings is also, that was something that was kind of confusing, but really makes sense now. And again, we're dating, 10 years, right? When I first went through the training, so I'm like, a magic string. Well, my background is software engineering, developer. So to me, a magic string is any string value that's hard-coded, right? So I'm thinking, well, why do I care? But the truth is, what it tries to do is and you're going to see this. It probably makes more sense when you see it, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. But you can say, let me say, dev test can pick it, service virtualization can pick it out of the recording for you, or you can tell it to say, with this VIN number, I want it to always be a match, and I want it to always look like this, okay? Let's see if they make it good. I haven't read this in a long time, so allow Virtual to return exact data for some value in a request, okay? Another good example would be, more common sense, was I always want the user Tim, okay? And if I pass in get user, you should always respond back with a Tim. Now, I've got a really good demo I'm going to do for this, so don't think too much about it. Just keep that loose term in your head of magic strings and magic dates as well, okay? It is very, very, very useful. Okay, and that's it. So this was just an introduction for terminology, and then we're going to jump into the demos.